for discussion. And that usually there are a lot of people who have, and in this case, I'm sure we'll have a lot of.
Oh, I would think there'll be a lot of discussion.
A lot of questions for you.
Absolutely, great.
The danger is that they start talking among themselves, so that the speaker himself is left rather marooned. But
is the audience largely historians, professional historians?
Well, it has a historical. It is a historical seminar, so most of the people, in one way or another, are historians or they have an interest in historical problems. But we try to open it up so that a journalist, for that matter, a scientist, has a historical problem that he wants to make and can present the chronology and so on. Well, we consider that just so much the better.
But of the audience here, so how many of these people would you consider professional historians? What percentage?
I'd say most of them. There are always a few people who are here as Woodrow Wilson fellows who come in as political scientists. So I'm not sure whether you know. That's the question of whether political scientists qualify as. I was just saying to Gideon that about 45 minutes is about right. Could we encourage some of the people to sit up?
Please move up to the table so that stragglers will have an easier time.
And take the sound off.
Okay, great.
Ellie Rose, who must be your uncle.
Emily is my sister.
And Emily is your sister. I'm gradually getting this straightened out. Wrote to assure me that this was bound to be a compelling session. So you have it by virtue of your uncle. This is. Ron.
The real historians in the family find it amusing that that I'm speaking to historians.
And how long have you been editor of Foreign Affairs now?
Almost exactly a year. I think I started on October 3rd or sorry, October 1st last year, so exactly 1 year.
Well, it's a great job.
Thank you.
Sure.
It's just started to get fun.
Well, we're very grateful to you.
Well, I'm delighted to be down here.
Seminar. This is Ron Steele, who is the historian of Lipton. Well, we'll actually get them to introduce themselves to you.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to this week's Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives, International and National Affairs. Delighted to welcome all of you. I'm Christian Osterman, the Director of History and Public Policy Program and the European Studies Program here at the Center, and delighted to welcome you also on behalf of my co-chair, Roger Lewis, of course represents the other institution involved in this jointly sponsored seminar, the National History Center, an initiative of the American Historical Association. As always, let me preface the introduction by giving thanks to the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations that helps sponsor this event. Let me say thanks to the National History Center, Roger, and also Marian Barber, and at my end, Alison Lilakoff and my staff for putting this event together. And of course, thanks to Gideon Rose for joining us for today on very, very interesting subject, why we botch the ends of wars, a subject that he has published extensively on. Let me, before I introduce him briefly, remind you that next week is Columbus Day, so we will not be meeting. And then on October 17th, Professor Hope Harrison from George Washington University will be speaking on the legacy of the Berlin Wall. Well, we're in for, I think, a particular treat today with Gideon. He, of course, is known to all of you as the editor of Foreign Affairs and the Peter G. Peterson Chair. He served as managing editor of Foreign Affairs from 2000 to 2010. Prior to this, he was an Olin Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to that, from 94 to 95, he served as Associate Director for East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. He held a number of other distinguished positions. Let me just say that he also has a BA in Classics from Yale and a PhD in Government from Harvard, and has taught American foreign policy at Columbia and Princeton. He has a long list of publications, major publications to his credit. Of course, most relevant to today's seminar, How Wars End, Why We Always Fight the Last Battle. He's also published co-edited Understanding the War on Terror, as well as a publication on America and the World, Debating the New Shape of International Politics. There's a much longer list, including books on the rollback fantasy and neoclassical realism and theories of foreign policy. I won't list them all now, but am just delighted and honored to give him the floor. But first call on Roger to say anything he'd like to say by way of introduction.
We do have certification that this is going to be an excellent talk. I got a message from Ellie Rose, the famous historian at NYU, saying that this will be an outstanding performance. Ellie Rose is Gideon's uncle, and so there is a family reassurance that is going on in this case. Gideon, we have a ritual in which we ask people simply to identify themselves, who they are, what their position, what their purpose is in life. The problem is that sometimes this is such a garrulous group that by the time we get around the table, there's very little time for the speaker himself actually to say very much. So I would ask people to be relatively brief, beginning with Ross Johnson.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center Senior Scholar.
Cha-Chen Besesta Men.
Josh Wassink, Scholar Intern.
Steve Weissman, Political Scientist.
David Kivig, former Wilson Fellow.
Kenton Clymer, I'm a scholar here this year.
Jennifer Wiederspoon, Scholar Intern.
Don Wolfensberger, Congressional Fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Mira Carrick, no affiliation.
Bruce Houston, past history teacher.
James Sang, IBM Research retired.
Nancy Sherman, past fellow and scholar here at the center.
Leslie Wiseman, film and theater journalist.
Bernie Cook, historian, Loyola University, New Orleans.
I'm Mickey Fabry. I'm a fellow here this year.
Olga Litvin, Scholar Intern.
Lauren Chauvin, Department of State.
Ronald Steele, University Emeritus and Wilson Senior Scholar.
Luciana De Benedetti, Scholar Intern.
Corinna Tia, Scholar Intern.
Megan Besky, the Associate Editor of the Wilson Quarterly.
Courtney Jolene, Wilson Quarterly Intern.
John Sewell, I'm a Senior Scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Bill Milam, me too.
I'm Steve Lagerfeld, editor of the Wilson Quarterly.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Donnelly. I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Edward Cunningham. I've been told to retire, but I'm actually very active in the venture capital area in the UK.
Miriam Cunningham, his daughter-in-law.
Bashak Advan, visitor.
Yafeng Xia, a fellow here this year.
Miriam Barber from the National History Center, and I want to point out that Miriam is also my predecessor as the staff person for this seminar.
Paul Foreman, historian of science, Smithsonian.
City Sudhir, American Historical Association.
Tekart, retired diplomat, Quandam historian of cultural diplomacy.
Maxim Harkovich, scholar intern.
Marley Clymer, I'm a retired nurse.
And we have two representatives of the AHA.
Arnita Jones, Executive Director Emerita from the AHA.
Landis Jones, Emeritus Professor, University of Louisville.
Very good. And with that, over to Gideon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I approached this talk with a bit of trepidation. As a political scientist, however historically oriented or qualitative, I know full well what historians think of us, and to speak about a topic in front of a bunch of historians is somewhat scary. My favorite the essence of this being captured, my wife, who is similarly trained and is even more historically oriented than I am, was up for a job at Princeton, and since her work was on Depression era policies in Europe, they had her meet with Harold James, the wonderful economic historian at Princeton, and they met and talked about her work for a while, and she eventually got the job. And a little bit later on, they were talking about in the department about some people to get a project in, and someone suggested getting Harold in, and the person said, well, you know, you should get Harold in. He's a big fan of yours. And she said, well, really? What do you mean by that? I didn't know he was a big fan of mine. And the person said, oh, well, you know, we asked him to what he thought of you when you applied. And she said, yeah. And what did he say? He said, well, she didn't get anything wrong. And my wife was like, well, that's damning with faint praise, you know. And the person said, oh, no, he's never said that about anybody. And I love that story because it sort of captures, for political scientists, the most we can hope for from historians is to say, they didn't get anything wrong, which really is a nice tribute from a historian. So hopefully I won't say too many things that are wrong and therefore incur the wrath of the serious professionals assembled here. But my diverse background as a historically oriented political scientist and also a policy wonk and minor government functionary directly relates to the project. So let me start by saying a little bit about how this project began, that ultimately became first a dissertation and then the book, and now a talk. Essentially, I was trained to think about war as a good Clausewitzian, to think that war is an extension of politics, to think that this told you most of the things you needed to know or was a guide to tell you where to look for the rest. And in thinking about a dissertation topic, it seemed to me that the transitions, the phase changes and phase shifts between force and the non-use of force in pursuing political ends was going to be an interesting place for Clausewitzian questions to come up with real force and passion. And so obviously the two major phase changes were when government policymakers decided to pursue their political ends with military means, and when they decided to stop pursuing their political ends with military means. And the starts of wars, the origins of wars, was pretty well covered and a pretty almost commonplace topic. And looking around, it turned out that the ends of wars, which should structurally be as interesting for a Clausewitzian, were in fact very rarely studied. And so I decided to work on that. And so the first thing I did was basically to look at the ends of American wars. And what I found when I looked at these war endings was, first, that they were indeed extremely interesting and largely unmined territory. And second, that they were extremely messy. In fact, they proved to be far messier, or they seemed to be far messier than they should have been. it seemed that government officials repeatedly made almost commonplace errors or made things worse than they had to be. And so the historical puzzle for me, and as I approached the project, was twofold. It was first to document what had happened, because there wasn't really a good existing source out there that showed how American officials had approached and handled the ends of major wars. And second, to explain what seemed to be this pattern of poor handling of the policy issues in question. And I felt confident that if I could do those two things, then the third leg of the stool, the policy implications for future decision makers, would flow somewhat naturally. And essentially, that's what I did in the book, which is I tried very hard to use whatever training as a historian I had received along the way to develop extremely careful case studies of how American policymakers handled the ends of wars for the last century. Essentially, they're case studies of World War I, World War II, both Pacific and Atlantic theaters, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the Iraq War. And in addition to trying to detail the behavior in question, I tried to explain why they had done what they did and why some of the things they did hadn't come off as well as they might have. Throughout all this, I tried to look at things with policymakers' eyes. We've all heard the expression about history as past politics. It's also past policy. And one of the things that I tried to do in doing the case studies was recreate the decisions that policymakers felt themselves choosing among, and explain why they chose the path they did. In some ways, you might think of it as an approach that tried to ascertain how history could have been different and why it wasn't. In other words, there's some kind of contingency in history that we perceive at every given moment along the way, but then once it's done, once the past is past, it seems like it's this inevitable progression of events unfolding out. And so what I tried to do was recapture the contingency that existed at the key policy points of each war and explain why the choices were made that were made and how they played out and so forth. What I found, basically, was that one of the chief reasons we continue to handle wars badly, the war endings badly, and stumble across the finish line without really knowing what's happening, is that policymakers tended to think about wars in the wrong way, which led them to fail to appreciate the seriousness of what a jargon-filled person might call war termination strategies, but simply really should be part of strategy per se, which is what you wanted to see at the end of the day, what positive outcome you wanted. And the reason I think that is because they took a fundamentally non-Clausewitzian approach to war. War has two different sides. Clausewitz famously described war as an active force to compel the enemy to do our will. He also famously described war as the continuation of politics with the addition of other means. Okay, this guy was a pretty smart guy. Why did he feel compelled to define the subject twice, define the topic twice? The answer is because there are two different sides. One is the active force, the negative goal, coercing the enemy to get him to do what you want. And the other is figuring out what it is you actually want, the positive, constructive goal. And this sort of, every war has this negative and positive duality to it. It involves going through some bad guy, some enemy, coercing an opponent, but to do so in the service of some larger political objective that you actually can achieve. And what I found was that American policymakers, I think mirroring, frankly, the American public, tended to focus obsessively on the first half, the negative struggle, and to ignore or deprecate or fail to pay sufficient attention to the second part, the constructive act. And they tended to feel that the real business of war was beating up the enemy, that you could separate military from political things, and that war had a kind of, even the people who acknowledged that it had two sides to it, and everyone, of course, pays lip service to Clausewitz. So even the people who said that felt that you would deal with this duality by splitting up and creating a functional and temporal division of labor, so that you would have civilian authorities, political leaders, and statesmen decide when we go to war and set the broad general goals. You turn things over to generals who fight the war, and then when that's done and victory has been achieved, you then turn things back over to the civilians and the diplomats to make the peace. And that this way everybody knew what they were supposed to do, everybody had a good set of responsibilities, and they should proceed very logically and appropriately. The best capturing of this was a comment that Tommy Franks, the CENTCOM commander, wrote back to the Defense Department. Actually, it was to the Undersecretary of Defense, just on the eve of the Iraq War, in which he says, to try and get them to stop meddling with his dispositions and plans, he says, "I'll focus on the day of, you focus on the day after." Okay, and the idea is we have sort of functionally separate roles. My job is to win the war, your job is to do this. Okay, this sounds very sensible, and it sounds responsible and mature and appropriate, but it's in fact entirely ridiculous, because as any good Clausewitzian knows, you can't separate out the military from the political. In fact, they're inextricably linked at all points along the continuum, and that the outcome that you're trying to achieve flows directly from the strategy that the strategy should flow from the outcome, and the outcome will in practice flow from the strategy you've adopted. So if you haven't combined the two, if you haven't combined your war planning and your post-war settlement into one coherent, unified whole, you're either going to get a different war outcome than you think, or you're going to have chaos come at the end. And that's the pattern, essentially, that plays itself out repeatedly that I found in my cases. And so just to jump to the end a little bit, the policy prescription that flows from this is actually fairly simple. It's one of these rocket science type observations that when you go to war, you should know what you want to achieve by it. You should have an outcome in the end that is your goal. You should then reverse engineer that outcome and develop a strategy that takes you from where you are to where you want to be. And that if you haven't managed to link in a coherent, clear, plausible series of steps where you are to where you want to be, then either you should rethink the war or rethink your outcome goal and essentially keep working the issue until you get that. Because if you don't do that, if you just sort of plunge in and hope things will turn out for the best, you're going to end up in a different place than where you want, or you'll get to the end and be like Robert Redford in The Candidate and go, okay, so what do we do now? And this sounds like, oh, it can't really be that simple, but it actually is, in the sense that Clausewitz did say that everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. But if you look at what happens in Iraq in both wars, and however much Bush the Elder and Bush the Younger differed in a whole variety of dramatic ways, they had this in common, which is they went to war, had lightning military victories, and got to the end and acted like Robert Redford in The Candidate, like, okay, so now what? And found themselves completely flummoxed because both of them had failed to, in their own respective ways, think through what they wanted to see at the end and how to get there. And they're both classic examples of brilliant military victories in many respects, turning to ashes in the aftermath because the military strategies were not connected to any kind of plan for an ultimate settlement. And I guess one way of putting the stories in the book is most people who sat through the Iraq War and watched it unfold and play out, certainly almost everybody who watched the aftermath, felt that this was a giant cock-up from start to finish. Even the people who thought it was well started felt it ended badly. And the way you could put the book is that's really more the rule than the exception. And it has less to do with the specifics of the people in the Bush administration. Maybe the egregiousness of the mistakes had to do with various specific circumstances that make it an ideal, case of screwing absolutely everything up and therefore paying the price. But it's remarkable when you look back carefully at previous wars just how common a whole variety of similar mistakes were and how unnecessary they were. The policymaker in me was very annoyed by the inefficiency and incompetence displayed by many senior officials in high positions previously. Regardless, and it had nothing to do with partisan things, it's not even consistent over time. Somebody could be very good in one war and then behave very stupidly in war number two. So basically what I do in the book, and I'll just take you through a couple of things briefly now, is go through some of, to back up some of these rather bold assertions and rather critical assertions. Woodrow Wilson, the only political scientist to actually achieve high political power in the United States, to be president. You would think somebody who wrote books as a social scientist would realize that if you set out your war game, your war objectives in ideological terms, democracy, reduction of arbitrary power, that you would have some kind of plan for operationalizing this. Absolutely not. Wilson basically knows that he wants Germany to have a different kind of leadership at the end of the war. In today's terms, Wilson decides after unrestricted submarine warfare that he wants to have regime change in Germany as one component of his war settlement. It wasn't the only component. In fact, he had sought a peace without victory before. People know this. In 1916, he put out this plan. What changes is he decides that the German government that could do something like unconditional submarine warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare, could not be a viable partner in maintaining the kind of settlement he wants. So you need a change in government in Germany. But he never specifies what this is. As with so many people who talk about regime change, he, in effect, thinks of the concept in a negative way, getting rid of something, but not in a positive way, not a change to something else, and never really unpacks regime. So this is actually a key point. Let me stop here for a second and pause and focus on this. I think regime change is one of the most pernicious concepts to have emerged in the last decade or so. And the reason for it is not because it's inherently bad to change the opponent's regime, but because it's a very serious, precisely because it's so important so often that you need to think about the subject clearly. And a phrase such as regime change is exactly what you don't want. Because first of all, it makes a complex subject, that of political order, seem simple by talking about regime without further definition. Second of all, it makes the construction, the destruction and construction of a new, the destruction of an old and the construction of a new political order, again, something very complex and difficult and intricate, seem simple by calling it change. But without further specification, regime change, everyone thinks they know what you're talking about. Well, what they actually think is, we don't want that guy there now. But how many of the people after him have to go? And it's usually a him. How many, what is the new regime going to look like? What are the sources of political order in the new thing? All these questions, which are inherent in the concept of regime change, are rarely discussed with the passion or substance or depth or complexity that they need to be before you make such a thing your goal. And so what ends up happening time and again is you get rid of something that you don't like, and you end up with what? You end up with the difficult, tricky task of creating and sustaining political order in the territory in question over the long term. We'll get to what the interesting implications of that are for contemporary cases, but let's just say that it'll be very interesting to see how Libya has played out, how Libya plays out in the future. In some ways, the easy part of Libya has been done. The tough part is going forward. To be fair and self-critical, I was banging on about these points during the Libya operation, which I thought was ill-conceived for precisely these reasons. So far, it has done far better or gone more smoothly than I expected, and I hope it continues on that path. even though it'll make me look like a fool if it does go well. But I will say that if it does go well, it's an extremely interesting case in and of its own right, because it shouldn't go well according to the facts on the ground, which is a country like Libya without any real basis for a new, positive, healthy political order should have, you would expect it to have problems in developing one, and if it doesn't have those problems, that'll be a very interesting case as well. Wilson makes much, but he doesn't specify what he wants. Why is this important? Well, in the early fall of 1918, the German army realizes it's beaten and comes to the German government and says, you have to concede. And the German government says, what are you talking about? And the army says, well, we're finished. We got to do this. And so concede. So the German government tries to develop plans for an armistice with Wilson and says, we accept your conditions. And this question, and they put a new government in place, Prince Max of Baden, who is formally a new government. And the question then becomes, does this constitute regime change? And Wilson, who had never before thought carefully about the subject, realized at that point, if not before, or maybe even later, that there's a difference between democratization and republicanization, or parliamentarization. What had happened, Wilhelmine Germany had all the elements of a constitutional democracy in place, except for the wiring. The chancellor was responsible to the monarch, not to the majority in the Reichstag. If you were to adjust the wiring on the German polity of Imperial Germany, you would have gotten a constitutional monarchy. It would not have been a republic, but it would have been a democracy, and that would have, in many respects, been acceptable. But this was not hadn't been discussed, hadn't been thought through, and so Prince Max of Baden, who might be thought of as the first true democratic ruler of Germany, tried in vain to get something going, and the Americans didn't know how to respond. And so they did there, and they go, abba, 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 abba. And there's an exchange of notes, which is extremely interesting, because they have no idea what they're doing, and the German government keeps going, is this okay? Is this okay? What do you want? And the Wilson administration doesn't know how to respond. And the French and Germans are content to have this play out. And actually, this is all significant because as they're dithering about the question of whether the Kaiser actually has to go or not, which is never resolved, never actually resolved. People think, well, yeah, you got to have the Kaiser go. Wilson never says the Kaiser has to go. And in fact, the Germans are asking, do you need the Kaiser to go? Do you need the Kaiser to go? And they never get a response. Fascinating historiographical discussion of this. You can look in the footnotes of the book. As this happens, the defeat continues, and Germany essentially spins out of control. So just as the armistice is signed, Wilhelmine Germany collapses, and an era of absolute turmoil erupts in Germany, and any chance for a sort of graceful or positive evolution is lost, and you have a year-long and more mess, which severely undermines I would argue, the chance for a sort of stable peace down the road. So Wilson's dithering makes it harder for him to arrest the war where he wants it to stop, and in fact, the logical momentum of the war continues further. So that's just one example of these kind of things. World War II, this exact same pattern repeats itself in the Pacific. We get lucky toward the end there, but essentially the Japanese government wants to surrender, but wants to keep the emperor. And the Truman administration, first the Roosevelt administration, then the Truman administration, knows it wants unconditional surrender, but has never really thought about its positive political programs. And so what happens in the summer of 1945 is a debate, a discussion, essentially, about what are the conditions of unconditional surrender going to be. And what I mean by that is there were always some implicit conditions. Okay, you weren't going to come in and massacre all the Japanese people. You weren't going to come in and conquer and colonize Japan permanently and absorb it into the American polity. Okay, there were certain things, and in fact, the Potsdam Declaration sets out a whole bunch of unilateral statements about what the United States and the Allies intend to do vis-a-vis Japan. The real question is, how much domestic political change is there going to be in the Japanese system? This has come to the American historiographical debate as the emperor question, but it really is best thought of in terms of the Japanese term for their system, the kokutai, which is really figuring out what exactly the political order of Imperial Japan was and what changing it would mean is a fascinating question. And so what happens is, even though the war is lost on the Japanese part, the question of whether you'll concede becomes an issue, or whether you'll fight to the last person. And there's a deadlock in the Japanese parliament. People who study this case know this. There's a deadlock in the committee. By the way, simplest rule from the World War II Japan case, if you're going to have a decisive government committee, make it an odd number of people. There's a 6-person Supreme War Council in Japan, and it splits 3-3, making it impossible and therefore making the war continue. And what happens is, as it continues, it takes literally an historically unprecedented intervention by the emperor to get the committee to change its vote and to accept the Allied terms. But that in and of itself isn't the end of the war, because there's yet another note, because the note that's sent back from the Japanese government is very similar in many respects to the note that's sent back by the Germans in the fall, the first or second note, which is, okay, we surrender subject to our keeping the emperor. They put a condition on it. And then the Truman administration finds itself in the same position that Wilson was in, which is, do we really want this? Do we accept this or not? And is their government, how much does their government have to change? And because the Truman administration can't actually decide, because these issues are ideologically fraught, they have public opinion weight behind them, they fudge the question. And then it gets sent back to the Japanese government, and there's yet another 3-3 deadlock. And the last 24 hours before the final decision is made are some of the most dramatic moments in 20th century military history, because once again the emperor decides to put himself forward and ask the members of the Supreme War Council to accept the Allied offer. The chief hawk in today's terms was the war minister, Korachika Anami, who basically doesn't want to give in, but sees himself as a feudal servant of his lord and master, the Emperor of Japan, and can't say no. So he not only accepts the need to listen to the emperor and agree to end the war, but puts down a coup or refuses to join a coup and in the army among radicals, and refuses and tells his staff, none of you are allowed to commit suicide because I know what you want to do, because surrender isn't consistent with your honor and so forth, but you're going to do it because the emperor says you're going to do it. But then the contradictions in this man are so wrapped up and so tight that before he himself will witness a surrender, after putting down a coup against the emperor, he then goes to his room, gets drunk, and commits suicide because he can't bear to live with a surrender being accepted. So the Japanese, the end of the war there, again, it comes down to this question of how much are we going to demand of the Japanese government? And that question is actually fudged in the final exchange of correspondence, and luckily so. The nearness of the end, we tend to think of this as, was the atomic bomb necessary? Or was it this has come down to the historiographical discussions as, was it the Russian entry, or was it the bomb, or this or that? In fact, the political angle, what were the demands that were being made, and how were they interpreted, and what aspects of the Japanese political system were being asked to be changed by whom and what, was actually the key question. And the bomb was important, but not nearly as decisive. And the fascinating politics of the last week played out after both bombs and Russian entry. So those of you who think of the Japanese war-ending case as being about the bombs and Russian entry and which was necessary or what, or a simple emperor guarantee, need to look back at the latest versions of the literature, which are really, really interesting. And again, this was actually handled pretty well, frankly, by the Americans. I think we lucked out a little bit at the end there. But it's a fascinating case. One last thing on World War II Japan, because it's too delicious a case to show the different national styles. Churchill and Truman are debating this, because Truman is gung-ho about not making any concessions. And Churchill, as both a somewhat more realistic person in this regard and himself a member of a monarchy who sees no real problems with the constitutional monarchy in principle, says, Harry, why don't we just offer them the emperor? We don't need to do this. We're facing an invasion of the home islands, and we should give in to their demands on this. And Truman responds back and says, Winston, I don't think they have any right, after Pearl Harbor and after what they've done during the war, they have no right to demand anything. Winston says, Harry, you're right. They have no right to demand this. But they do have something that they seem to care about a lot more than we do, and that would cost us a lot to get. So isn't it just a matter of simple utilitarianism? They care more about this than we do. Why would you want to spend this many troops to get something that really is not that important? So they ask Stalin what he thinks. Stalin goes, let me get this straight. They want a guarantee of the emperor being kept in power. Yeah. You guys don't want the emperor to be kept in power. If they give you the emperor, if you give them the emperor, you can go into Japan and occupy Japan. Stalin says, I'm not sure I get this. Why not just promise them they can have the emperor, and then when you get to Japan, do whatever you want with him? And Churchill knows about, recoil. This is documented. We have these exchanges. And it's hysterical. It's like the difference in opinions. So Churchill saying, who cares about the emperor? The constitutional monarchy is fine. Truman is a good Republican ideological thing. Absolutely not. And Stalin, the most cynical of all of them, going, what is the problem here? Promise him anything and then go in and put a shiv in his back at the end. It's a great illustration of the different national leadership styles. The German side has its own interesting examples, but I'll just move quickly through it. Every war, I guess, one thing I would say is the initial instinct that I had in approaching the subject that Clausewitzian questions would emerge at the ends of wars that were interesting and worthy of greater attention than they had received in the literature was 100% validated by my research. Every single war turns out to have these unbelievably interesting, dynamic, dramatic, and politically important stories surrounding the ends, which are very rarely looked at. So any one of these cases could really just be developed out at length. Vietnam, Korea. How many people know, here, I don't want to tell an audience what they already know. How many people know about the prisoner repatriation question in Korea? A few, okay. The Korean War, I'll make this one very short. The Korean War lasted about a year and a half longer than it needed to because Dean Acheson covered up something that he should never have covered up, and the American government acted rather stupidly. And I say that as an Acheson fan and as someone who was just admiring Truman in the previous case. Basically, all issues in the armistice, everyone knows about the first year of the Korean War. And all the dramatic shifts and turns and back and forth. David Halberstam's last book had, I think it was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages about the first year of the war and, 30 pages on what happened from the start of the armistice talks. This is bizarre. The war lasted 3 years. Why is it that everything everybody knows about the Korean War is about the first year? All they know about the later years is from watching MASH. And it's the idea of this endless struggle that goes on with Panmunjom armistice talks going on in the background. Ask yourself this. If they started the talks, why did it take twice as long for the war after the talks started to continue than it took to get to the talks in the first place? It shouldn't have taken that long. There's a logical puzzle there. Well, about 6 months of that were debate over real issues, what you would call, not real issues, that's an unfair way of putting it, issues you would expect, a realist would expect to arise. What is the exact demarcation line going to be of the armistice? What are the security arrangements afterward going to be? Who's going to get what kind of leg up? The kinds of things you'd expect negotiations to focus on. All of those issues were resolved by mid to late winter of 1959. 152. Only one issue remained. And in fact, formally, by March, only one issue remained. And that was the disposition of the prisoners of war. And the only reason and the Chinese, or the communist forces, put forward what had been the historically traditional all-for-all prisoner exchange as the standard thing. If the American government had accepted all-for-all prisoner exchange, as has always been the case before and after, the Korean War would have ended sometime in the late spring of 1952. Maybe that decisiveness, some people might dispute the decisiveness of that, but I think objectively that's what the record shows. Why didn't it? Well, because in the first 6 months of those negotiations, a principle had hardened on the American side that was first put forward for psychological warfare reasons and then picked up for ideological reasons. And it was basically that we should allow the communist prisoners in UN hands to choose whether they wanted asylum. And this choice should be offered to them. And if they wanted to stay in South Korea or stay in Taiwan rather than go back, they should be given that right. This was first adopted because it was a black eye. It would have been a black eye for the communist regimes. And for the American policymakers involved, there was a terrible memory of the end of World War II in the Atlantic of Russian prisoners of war being sent back to the Gulag, screaming and crying and committing suicide, and Truman and Atchison didn't want to repeat that because they had felt like shits. Everyone had done it. Everyone had gone along with it because that was the price the Soviets had demanded for getting American prisoners and troops back. But they felt very badly about that, and so the idea here was, well, we could, I don't want to do that a second time. Let's just enshrine the principle of repatriation. And it might have worked okay, except for one thing. The prisoner of war camps in Korea, the UN prisoner of war camps. I'm not talking about the death camps on the Yalu, who were famously awful conditions from the communist camps. The UN prisoner of war camps in Korea were basically Abu Ghraib with kimchi. And they were run on a contract basis, essentially, by the dregs of the American army plus the local South Korean and Taiwanese regimes. So gangs, essentially, of Chiang Kai-shek's and Syngman Rhee's goons had organized and run the camps. And they had an interest not in ending the war and in maximizing the number of prisoners to go back to allow the Chinese to accept it, but rather in maximizing the number of prisoners who would say, no, we want to stay in the South. We want to stay in that. And they organized massive campaigns, essentially, to jack up the number of people who would choose asylum. They would do things like, and again, this is all documented and it's actually being reported up to Atchison, who actually doesn't bother to understand this at first, realizes it too late and decides to cover it up. They would do things like, okay, so they finally decide they're going to have a screening to see how many prisoners want to go back. And if only a few will do it, the Chinese will accept this. So the prison camp guards organize a screening. Okay, on Tuesday we're going to have a screening. Okay, so everybody line up. And everybody who wants to stay in South Korea or stay in Taiwan, take one step forward. Okay, and everyone who wants to go back home, stay where you are. Okay, we'll see. Okay, guards, can you go and beat up everybody who didn't step forward? Thank you. Whap, 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 whap. Okay, interesting. Well, okay, guys, we're going to do this again tomorrow, on Wednesday, with the UN representatives here. So let's try that again tomorrow, okay? And the next day, the UN representatives would come for the screening, and they would do it. And of course, as you might imagine, when they asked the question the second day, the number of people who chose asylum went up rather dramatically. And I'm being somewhat facetious, but this is all documented. There was a wonderful ambassador at the time, Philip Muccio, a man who actually deserves more of a reputation than he has. I didn't come across him except in the detailed research by people like Rosemary Foote on this case, or Callum MacDonald. And there really is excellent reporting going back, telling all the details. But the State Department doesn't care, doesn't want to hear it, and then sweeps it under the rug. And essentially what happens is when the screening figures come back, it's so large that the Chinese negotiators realize they cannot accept this and break off the talks. And for a year and a half more, the talks get stalemated on this one issue alone. And we nearly, depending on which account you read, might have come somewhat close to nuclear war had the Eisenhower administration made good on some of its threats to continue ending the war, to end the war unilaterally in some respects if the Chinese didn't give in. Luckily, what happens is that Stalin dies and the Chinese position, the Soviet position shifts after Stalin's death. China's position shifts after the Soviets decide it's okay to let it switch. And then Syngman Rhee solves part of the problem himself by releasing all the Korean prisoners in his hands in a very dramatic event. And luckily, the war ends. But it's a very much more complicated ending in Korea than people think. And it's a good lesson, again, of how policymakers don't take lessons, don't take questions about what you should do in war ending seriously. If anybody had actually sat down and think, and you say to yourself, how could people of the caliber of Truman and Acheson never stop to ask themselves, gee, is establishing this war aim as a central feature of American policy going to screw up our plans to end the war? If you had said to them, you know what, you're going to get a year and a half more of war out of this. Do you really want to do this? They would have said, no, are you kidding? Not at all. It was a cheap idea for Acheson, a cheap propaganda ploy, and for Truman it was an emotional thing. But they could have been convinced out of it if they had recognized, if they had priced out the decision before they made it, they would have made a different decision. And then once it was public, it was very difficult to walk it back. But it's yet another example of a kind of screw up that makes war ending more difficult in practice than it really should have been. I could go on. One last thing about Korea, which actually raises a big thing, which is Korea, as I indicated with regard to the prisoners, a constant theme in the book. When I was trying, in my political science hat, I was trying to explain the material that I was seeing, not just account for it, and not just trace it and lay it out there, but explain why things played out as they did. And so I tested various kinds of theories in a qualitative political science test. And one of the theories I threw in, one of my advisors in grad school was a guy named Ewan Fung Kong, who did a great book on the role of analogies in the early Vietnam War decisions. Very nice book. And Ewan, so I had taken a course on sort of cognitive psychology in security studies with him. And I thought, okay, I'll throw in as a representative of the cognitive work in IR, a lessons of last war approach. We all know there's this sort of, house folk wisdom that we fight, generals fight the last war, but that's actually, you could make a real hard theory about that because cognitive psychology talks about the use of frames and the use of patterns and analogies, and so the last war would be the most salient and available analogy that you would use, and so you'd expect if certain kinds of psychological factors were driving decision makers that regardless of whether there were actually any plausible links between War I and War II, if those were the two wars in sequence, a cognitive psychological approach focusing on the ends of wars would argue that that's what you should see them trying to avoid that. And I thought I threw this in figuring, who knows, let's see. I was amazed. It actually performed extremely well, and there are whole aspects of every single war that were best explained by decision makers, again, behaving as if they were robots rather than thinking creatures, almost acting under some kind of impulse to not repeat the perceived failures of the last war. Whatever the perceived, you tell me, the other big thing that played out well was power, because the more you can do, the more ambitious you get. The less power you have, in good realist fashion, the less power you have, the more restrained your goals are, and the more power you have, the more you get hubristic and try big extensive things. So Iraq, it is no surprise that you have this giant bit of hubris in Iraq at the height of American global unipolarity and hegemony. That's what you'd expect in many respects. But if you tell me, okay, here's which direction American power on a relative basis went from War X to War Y, and you tell me what lessons were the commonly held lessons, publicly available, and everybody knew this is the lesson of the last war, from War X, I can give you about 75% of what the country will do in the next war, which is really remarkable. I didn't expect that at all, but it's astonishing how much that plays out. So, Colin Powell fights, the Gulf War, along with every other member of the U.S. Armed Services, with Vietnam right there in his mind. Okay, why do we leave Saddam in power? Why do we? Actually, that's an interesting question we can get into if you want. But why does the entire U.S. military want to get the hell out of Iraq the minute they get in there? Why do they want to make it neat and clean and quick and have no entangling circumstances? Because the last thing they want is to repeat anything having to do with Vietnam, and because living up to or not making the same mistakes as the Vietnam mistakes were the chief thing on their mind. The fact that Kuwait and Iraq had about as much in common with, Vietnam as they have with this conference room was irrelevant, because what was in their mind was the last war. And you see that in Korea with the prisoners, again, which is, you ask yourself, what the hell were they so focused on prisoners? Well, the reason they were focused on prisoners, and the reason you have this screw up at the end of the Korean War, right, is because United States power was at a huge peak. Right? It was the early Cold War. America bestrode the globe like a colossus. It had a huge amount of surplus power, which meant you could focus on a whole variety of relative luxuries ideologically. And one of the most important memories from the end of the last war that was living right in their minds a few years in the past, that was traumatizing them, was the return of the prisoners against their own will. So you put those two things together, you get the prisoner. And otherwise inexplicable. The people who do Korea have done a wonderful job since the archives opened in tracing the prisoner story, except that since they only do Korea, they haven't treated it as the bizarre anomaly in military history that it actually is. If you look at other wars and you ask yourself, what were the goals fought over? And then you say to yourself, enemy prisoners' right to asylum. That just doesn't cut it. That is not something that we have ever fought over. Not our own prisoners. Remember, this is during a time when the American prisoners were being brainwashed and fed, bugs and starved to death in the death camps on the Yalu. Those prisoners could have been brought home any time we wanted if we had traded the communist prisoners for them. And if you ask how often we've given a damn about the enemy prisoners in our own hands, from Andersonville to Abu Ghraib, the answer is not much, right? So it's a very bizarre analogy. It's a very bizarre case. And so to ask yourself, why did that case, the people who study Korea have done a great job of documenting it, but they haven't compared it to others, and it hasn't gained the notoriety it has as a weird outlier. And that's the kind of thing. Anyway, I do Korea, and I do the two Iraq cases. Again, let me just jump to the end and throw it open to your questions. The policy implications of this are pretty simple, which is a lot of the mistakes. War is going to be hard, and there are always going to be a lot of difficult answers, a lot of difficult questions in handling the ends of wars. But it is the role of responsible policymakers, it seems to me, to not make their own job harder. Okay? The questions surrounding the ends of wars are hard enough to deal with, are costly enough in blood and treasure, to not add to the problems by failing to plan carefully, by failing to think through what you're doing, by failing to think realistically and plausibly. And so the one simple takeaway from the book is, before you, when you're developing your plans for a war, and I have a lot more sympathy for people who are attacked and have to develop a plan on the fly. They still have the same obligation to figure out a strategy and a goal that links them to a positive outcome. But a fortiori for people who start a war of choice themselves, there's no excuse for starting a war without figuring out what you want to achieve by it and how your actions are going to bring about that outcome. And it sounds like common sense, and it really is. But what turns out is that the decision makers in power tend not to act with the common sense responsibility that they do. This shouldn't be surprising to us. Okay, everybody knows what it takes to lose weight. Okay, you eat relatively small amounts of relatively healthy food, and you get some exercise. This is not rocket science. This is not something that is beyond the bounds of human ingenuity to understand. And yet, millions and millions, tens of millions of ridiculous diet books are sold every year. Everybody is doing the cleanse or the grapefruit diet or this or that cockamamie scheme just to avoid the simple, basic, obvious common sense of what to do. Everybody, study after study has shown that in the long run, you can make at least modest amounts of money by investing in a broadly diversified way, by saving, investing by controlling costs, by diversifying your strategies and holding for the long term. Study after study. And yet, the vast majority of people don't do that. And in fact, these are the most fascinating studies. People who invest in mutual funds do less well even than the funds they invest in. Why? Because they were driven by fear and greed. They buy in at the peak, they sell out at the bottom, and they can't follow even the most basic common sense rules of investing. And so basically what I found in my work was, and this by the way, really bothered me and surprised me, and I was really reluctant, far from being a critic or a radical or a skeptic. I am about as establishmentarian a fellow as exists. I am about as deferential a peon of the systems of power as is out there. And the idea that we have these repeated screw-ups in foreign policy, simply not because of any broad structural pattern, but because people in power just continually screwed up by acting irresponsibly rather than by following, acting like instead of acting like the Surgeon General, they acted like, a fad dieter. Instead of acting like a fiduciary responsible principal, they acted like, your brother-in-law watching Jim Cramer or something like that. And that's how we approach wars. And it's really, and our outcomes show the results. And so the lesson going forward is, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to basically think about it like a serious, honest professional. It's not going to make life easy, but it's going to avoid making life even harder than it has to be. And if we can do that, we'll be way ahead of the historical game. And that's what I tried to suggest. And I have no illusions after doing all the research for the book that it's going to be adopted because this was started as a dissertation years ago, and every war since has just followed the same damn pattern. So I have no illusions that the next ones will be any better, but I felt obliged to try to write the book to say it out there in case, so at least I can say, gee, I told you so.
Thank you.
Gideon, could I ask just a preliminary question for historical bearings? Just for a comparison, say between Wilson and Roosevelt, or for that matter, Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, and so on. Are some of these administrations better than others in bringing about coherent ends to wars? In other words, in the sense of thinking out in a sustained way the problems of war aims and interdepartmental problems, or are we sort of doomed, as you seem to suggest at the end, that whatever we do, there's going to be a cock-up at the end?
I think it's going to be difficult in the end. We're not doomed to it, and it's less about broad administrations than it is about the individuals at the very center of power and their ability to discipline themselves. I mean, the problem is we live in a democracy. Of course we're a democracy, but really Washington is like a court, and never more so than in wartime. And so finding ways, if you're an executive, a chief executive, to avoid believing everything you say is perfect and to really getting sort of tough, serious advice and thinking hard about the questions you're in is really very difficult. And I think that the ability to do that is what I would want in my chief executive, much more so. An inquisitive mind, an openness to dissent, and a willingness to face the tough questions. Part of the problem is that, there are a lot of tough questions out there, but no one wants to really face them, and so they kick the can down the road to avoid facing the questions. And you want to. There's always a 5% chance you can get everything you want without having to pay a cost. And every politician who's ever lived is an improviser who feels they can maneuver best and the time's on their side and they'll win. And so when you put those things together, since there's a short-term cost to limiting your choices, they always want to sort of kick things down the road and hope it works out. And Roosevelt, of course, was the perfect example of this, right? Poor Truman. I think I came away a big Truman fan from really looking at this stuff carefully, even though he screwed up in Korea to a certain extent, at least in my case in Korea. He got a lot of really tough questions thrown at him in 1945, and I think he handled them, frankly, pretty well. But Roosevelt had set things up for a giant screw-up because he had promised too many things to too many people, and the bills would have all come due at the end of the war anyway. It's tough. One thing someone always asks me is, who did it well? For all their pathologies in other spheres, I think Nixon and Kissinger actually did a pretty good job in Vietnam. I made that case. People will disagree with that, and no one did it perfectly. It didn't work, but it almost did, which is better than for some people. I think Bismarck did a damn good job. My wife said, "You can't say Bismarck. The Germany he created went on to cause giant problems for the world at large." Yeah, I said, but that's what he did with Germany. What Germany did with itself after the wars of German unification are a separate question. He said, "No, they're not a separate question. They're inherent in the state that he built," which may be true. But the actual process of fighting wars for fairly limited ends, knowing what you want, ending them the right way, and then making okay peace. The maneuvering that Bismarck did in the third quarter of the 19th century was pretty damn good. And I think if you were to take the Truman administration and join it to Roosevelt and see World War II as a whole, and take the early Cold War as the last stage of World War II, which is the way I think it should be seen, then I think Roosevelt and Truman together have the best and wisest outcome. Because when you ask yourself, what did they achieve? Well, they didn't just beat up world historical evil. They created the basis for sustained liberty and prosperity in a large section of the globe, and that's a hugely positive outcome.
Thanks. All right, the floor is open. If you could wait for the microphone and just remind Gideon of your name, to be great. Don, and then hold on, microphone.
Don Wolfensberger. I think your last comment really answered the question I was going to raise, and that is, I don't think we did mess up after World War II compared to World War I, because we had learned lessons. We did occupy, we did rebuild, we did help build the new institutions, both in Japan and Germany, and so to me that there was a learning curve that took place there. Is that basically what you conclude?
Yes, but much of that, we tend to elide 1945 to 1947 from the historical story, or see it only in terms of the negative spiral into the Cold War. In fact, and there's a wonderful memo, I think it's a Bolin memo, I should have brought the book, that in 1945 to 47, the United States does a Homer Simpson. It basically tries to walk away from Europe and realizes that it can't, and it goes, oh! And they restructure the entire post-war plan. The entire post-war system, as designed during the war itself, was supposed to be on a universalistic basis. Security, economics, everything was supposed to be universal. And what happens in the late 40s and early 50s is that you recreate that system on a partial regional basis in the West. So you end up with NATO as divided Germany, NATO as the protector of the Western sphere, the Marshall Plan, and the Truman Doctrine as other kinds of things. And you create all those wonderful things, and you get, yes, a Cold War, but also at least stability and reconstruction in half the world. But all that was an improvisation in the late 40s that was not the original vision. So it is the logical culmination and the wise. I think the creation of the post-war world in the West was a brilliant improvisation to achieve the goal, to achieve as much as salvageable of the original goals. But it required a shift in course, and it was very difficult, and it was not what they had wanted to do in the plan. If you had told people, and again, if you think of the American presidents in Europe, if you had told Roosevelt that, you'd have troops in there forever. If you had told even Eisenhower, if you had told that, my God, no, forever. If you had told people you're going to get stability and reconstruction in Europe, and a lot of the goals you want, but it's going to take, decades of open-ended American involvement, tons and tons of aid, an endless Cold War with the Soviet Union until it collapses, several decades later. But then you'll basically get what you fought for all along. They would look at the outcome at the end of the day and say, hey, that's pretty damn good. That's a lot of what we wanted. Wow, gee, did it really take all that much to get there? And the response back would be, yeah, and you're lucky that we came up with practical plans to accomplish even that much, given the complexities of the promises you had made and the things you had left us with at the end of the war. So I would think that. So I think that's true, but that's why I give, Truman and Marshall and Atchison and the post-war. I think that the veneration, that's too strong a word, but the respect with which the early post-war generation is held in the American foreign policy establishment is, to some extent, correct.
Okay, Kevin.
That was a fascinating talk and important, I think. But I have a kind of a methodological question, I guess. When you're going back and looking at your historical examples, how do you deal with the seriously conflicting historiographical accounts of these people? I mean, there's several Wilsons out there, and certainly you mentioned Kissinger and Nixon. Surely there's very conflicting views of what they did and so forth.
It's a fascinating question, and this was actually far and away the most fun for me because basically it was me playing a historian. I mean, I would be the first to say I'm a political scientist, not a historian. I'm a historian manqué. I got my admission to Yale history in the grad school and chose to go to Harvard in government, and so I had that path and I walked away from it. But I got a chance to redo it a little bit in doing this, and I faced there the same problems that you guys face when you do historical research. I read everything I possibly could. I read all the secondary stuff. I read all the primary stuff that was available. I went and supplemented for any war that involved people still alive. I went back and talked to them about it and formed the relying on as authoritative contemporaneous primary sources as I could, supplemented by other material as necessary and available. I formed the most compelling interpretation of each case that I could, and then bounced that off experts who specialized in that particular case to tell me where I was wrong and amend the case. And I would say like all historical work, there's something of a work in progress aspect. I don't think it'll be overturned, but I would say that the case studies speak for themselves. And if you know the cases, put it this way, I would hope that people who know the wars in question would feel that what I have told them is consistent with what they know and added to it things that they didn't know. And I felt like saying, if there's something I got wrong, I will, not just debatable, but wrong. I'll offer $20 to anybody who could find a factual mistake. My publisher said, you can't say something like that, so don't do that. But it's been great fun. And in fact, the most fun part, or some of the most fun, was engaging after I had done my work with the real specialists in each case and saying, okay, I'm just an amateur, so talk to me about this. And that was really fun. I mean, okay, you mentioned Vietnam. I had Win Lord, who was, one of Henry's deputies on the negotiations, read the case carefully. Win's a friend, and he read it and gave me detailed comments. I had academic historians of Vietnam whose work I find absolutely impeccable. Go over it tooth and comb, and say, is there anything that you think I'm not defensible here? And a buddy of mine, Tim Naftali, who's the head of the Nixon Library, is a close friend and has been for decades. And Tim was saying to me, okay, are you incorporating the tapes? I said, well, I'm incorporating the tapes that I have, that I can access to. He said, well, you should see the stuff we have here. It's unbelievable. I'm like, well, have you gotten the tapes ready yet? He says, well, no, we haven't released that period yet. And I said, okay, that's great. I said, how many of them are there? He said, well, you can come listen to some of them if you want. I said, well, how many? Well, there are a few thousand hours on this kind of stuff. I'm like, Tim, how the hell do you expect me to listen to a few thousand hours of tapes? Prerequisite? It's impossible. He said, well, so I said, okay, you're the head of the Nixon Library, and you're telling me that you got all this wonderful stuff there that I would make my day if I could only listen to it, but I can't listen to it, or I can't even have access to it. So how the hell am I supposed to write? We'll delay the book for another 20 years until I can do this? He said, no. I said, okay, tell you what. You've read stuff that's out there. What have you, let's go a different tack. What have you read that, I used to do this with people in government who had classified backgrounds, who had knowledge that I wanted. Like I was doing a report on Pakistan's nuclear program once for the council, and I was talking to a friend who had full access to all the intelligence. And I said, okay, I want to know, I know you can't tell me how many bombs we think Pakistan has, but I tell you what, I'm going to say something. And it's like the Woodward and Bernstein, right? If I'm off, tell me that I'm off. And if you don't say anything, I'll figure that you're okay with this estimate. He said, okay. I said, well, I think Pakistan, I'm about to write that Pakistan, that according to our best sources, Pakistan has X to Y bombs. Okay, thank you very much. So, I tried this with Tim. I said, Tim, okay, what publicly available source gives the best interpretation of Nixon that comports with what you're hearing on the tapes? You're the head of the Nixon Library. There must be something out there that you've read that got it right. That retrospectively you can say, yes, this is what we're seeing. And he said, that's a good question. Yeah, I think there is. I said, what? He said, Sapphire's memoir. I said, Sapphire wrote a memoir? I didn't know that. He said, yeah, Sapphire wrote a memoir. It's fantastic. I went back and looked at this. Has anybody read William Sapphire's memoir? Unbelievable. I fully agree. Not only does the head of the Nixon Library say it's the best thing written on Nixon, but I would now say agree. It is this portrait of Nixon by, a longtime Nixon loyalist, a Jewish libertarian who found out that his boss was an anti-Semite who tapped his phone. A full appreciation of all the complexities of Nixon is found in this. And they're so delicious, and it's so apt that it really captures the man in full. And it really helped me understand Nixon a little bit, and it helped me understand that kind of thing. And I actually put a large quote in the book in the footnotes. It was too good to lose, so I kept a large thing. So, but basically, I would say the research, as with any of our work, the research speaks for itself. And if I did get things wrong, and if I am honored enough to have people read the book, and you think that I got something significantly wrong, I would be delighted to hear what I got wrong, so that I could change it in the future or do better next time.
All right. Yafang, and then we'll go to gentleman over there and then to Bill.
Yafang Shah, Wilson Center Fellow. My question is about the prisoners of war, which you talk about during the Korean War. I remember some scholars argue that for Truman and Atchison, the reason to continue the war because they were pressured by the military, because the military want to continue the war and to increase the budget. Have you ever come across any of the documents which prove this argument?
No, and in fact, I think that let's put it this way. The failure to end the Korean War cost the Democrats an election. It cost huge amounts of money. It continued the agony of many Americans trapped behind the enemy lines in prison camps there, and it involved thousands and thousands of American war dead. For that all to have occurred, because it strengthened a certain case for a certain kind of defense policy, would be beyond imagining. it's as if that would be on the level of saying that we went to Iraq for Halliburton or something like that, which, however, there have always been war profiteers. There have always been private sector, military, industrial beneficiaries from American foreign policy and American military actions. To think that the highest levels of American national security policy and politico-military policy is set because of what the arms merchants want or what their Iron Triangle allies want, I just think doesn't hold up, and in fact, the opposite.
Okay. Gentlemen, we'll take two questions together.
A nihilist question. In tying war, conducting war, and ending wars together, I wonder, would you say a few words about how really compatible these are? What I'm thinking of in particular is the famous line from von Neumann, who pointed out that chess was a computation and poker a game. And I'm wondering whether war is a computation and peace actually a game, and therefore you really can't expect that one who's good at one can do the other one.
Well, this is a great... okay.
No, go ahead.
It's a great question. And in fact, that's actually what happens, which is there's a tendency in the military to focus on the... Not only is chess... Put it this way. Okay, we've seen Big Blue play chess. Exactly. And the aspects of war that are chess-like or mechanical or Jomini-like or engineering-like are easier. They don't seem like it. People get insulted when you say this, but they are. Politics is tough. It involves a whole bunch of weird, messy, difficult human things that don't have easy answers. Military officers, most of them, like to deal in a very precise, ordered, organized world. They are happier dealing with the non-political aspects of war. They would love nothing more than to be able to shed responsibility. Far from being militarists, American military types would love to shed responsibility for the larger things and deal with the sort of Jominian aspects of war or the pure military science aspects. Tommy Franks, in being exactly that type of general, you might call them a good brigadier general or something like that, not even a good lieutenant general, and certainly not a good general of the army or commander-in-chief. Somebody who can take a battalion and lead it very well into battle or division and really move it around and fight well. That kind of thing is what they want to do. The challenge in warfare is how do you harness that to some political end? Because there is no such thing as a purely military maneuver. It is only war. Everything about war gains its force from the political motive, and so figuring out how to blend the two. Clausewitz says at one point that to end a war or one of its campaigns successfully requires the commander-in-chief to act simultaneously as a statesman, and that's absolutely true. So even if there are parts of war, middles of campaigns, lower-level tactical things that can be handled at that level, the beginning, the end, the grand strategy of the war has to involve both. And so it's a challenge, and the inability to grapple with that challenge successfully, by the way, is one of the reasons why Germany lost both wars, because they weren't good at that larger scale of things, and even if they were excellent on the lower-level scale of stuff.
All right, final question, Ambassador Milo.
Hi, Bill Milam again. I have two questions, really, but one of them is quite short and factual. Getting back to the First World War, the end thereof, and Wilson's inability to make up his mind about Prince Max of Baden and so forth. But I didn't get from what you were saying where the French and the British were on all of this. That must be in your book, which I guess I could go read. But the question is, they had lost millions and millions of men. They must have had some idea of what kind of end they wanted to the war, and I wonder if you could enlighten me on that.
They did. They had a very... Wilson, I focused on his failure to define democracy. What Wilson really... There was a larger failure in Wilson's plan. Wilson was trying a very difficult act. He entered the war not simply to defeat Germany. Okay, there's a reason he called France and Britain he was an associated power, not an ally, right? Because he felt that the world he wanted to bring about after the war was not the old world of realpolitik. And he did not enter the war, however much other Americans might have thought they were trying to beat Germany. He was trying not just to beat Germany, but to bring about the new world that he wanted. And for that, Britain and France had to be kept in check as well. So while the British and French wanted to screw the Germans, Wilson wanted to keep both of them in check and balance them off against each other. And so he deliberately wanted to end the war with German power somewhat intact in a way the British and French didn't. And so that's why the Germans appealed to him, because they thought they could get a better deal with him than they could with the British and French. And it would have been in his interests, if he could, to cut some kind of deal with the Germans in order to hold it off and then keep the two poised. What happened is, because of, it was probably, as I say in the book, it would have taken somebody of Bismarck's Machiavellian skill to pull this off in the first place. But by fudging around and futzing around and not planning carefully, he lost even that. And so German power essentially evaporates in October, November, December, January, throughout the whole winter of 1918 and 1919, so that by the time you have the peace conference in Versailles, everyone focuses on Versailles. My own feeling is that Versailles is a mere epilogue, because the patterns of triangular diplomacy, of Britain and France trying to screw the Germans and Wilson trying to stop them from screwing the Germans that much, and the Germans sort of helpless and prostrate and having to accept whatever is dumped on them. That pattern of Versailles is actually a recapitulation in the peace terms of what plays out on the battlefield and in the diplomacy of the fall of 1918.
That raises a what-if question, which I won't ask because it takes too long. My second question was about Afghanistan, but primarily about the pattern I seem to see there, at least, whereas, again, the U.S. does not have an idea of how it wants the war to end. But the obvious truth there is that everybody's got a different opinion. The military has a view. Some of the civilians have one view. Some have another. But my question goes back to the other parts of your essay. Do these same interagency or inter-sector problems get into the other ends of other wars, and how did they play up in your examples?
They do get into, and all these things play, and the interagency stuff less so than you might think, because the presidents really do have a huge amount of power. And so if the president has a view in mind, President and National Security Advisor, if the president and his chief advisors want to do something, they usually can. And so they're the interagency and the bureaucratic stuff tends to come in either on the operational details of things or at the lower level below. If not against, they don't force the president to do what he wants. The president has a lot of power, even though they don't say that. And Afghanistan, all I'd say is, I actually think they are doing a Nixon in Vietnam kind of thing. I think they're trying to tiptoe out while the other parties continue to fight. I wrote an op-ed to this effect in the Washington Post earlier in the summer, and so you can Google that if anybody wants to know. What I will say, and historians here will probably nod their heads, is it's really kind of depressing to see how difficult it is to write about current cases with the sort of confidence and seriousness with which one writes about sort of historical cases. It's much easier if you have all the damn evidence there. However difficult it is to make sense of it, it's at least the damn thing isn't moving out from under you in a very difficult challenge. I found it much tougher to write about the contemporary cases, even though that's what I supposedly do on a day-to-day basis.
Getting in the last question, because it's the unanswered question from the title of your talk, Implications for Libya.
Okay. As Libya was going on, I thought this was a case study in how to do everything wrong. We said what we didn't want, Gaddafi in power, not what we did want. We had absolutely no clue. We put out ends without committing the means for them. And this seemed to me a total bit of idiotic planning, or lack of planning. And sure enough, at first, it seemed that I was proven correct, which is something that they said would take days, if not weeks, and that would be relatively simple and cheap, took several months and was bogged down and cost a lot more than they thought and got them into some problems. Now, at the end of the day, because of the huge disparities involved, we moved forward and Gaddafi was kicked out and the rebels won. And the initial attempts to maintain order have gone better than I thought. And we haven't seen anything like a sort of the squabbling, chaotic civil war that broke out in Vietnam. In Iraq. If indeed Libya manages to go from where it was to something significantly positive, without a lot more turmoil on the ground, it'll be amazing, because the whole point of the burden of my research was that political order, and the burden of research everywhere else in political science, I would say, is that political order is difficult to generate. It's not something you can sort of throw a little bit of money or planning at and summon forth. There's no dehydrated political order that you can throw in and pop it out. There was in the early Afghan war. There was a couple of years ago under McChrystal, they had this idea of government in a box. You might have seen that reference. You can't have government in a box. And so if Libya manages to make do with this chaos and not screw up or not fade into it, then it'll be fascinating to watch. Everything I'm saying suggests that you be very, very careful. Not that you shouldn't intervene, not that you shouldn't topple things, but that you should have a plan ready for what you want to do. I think, even if Libya turns out well, I think that we will have gotten lucky, because we had no right for it to turn out well. We didn't know what we wanted. We went in allying with people we knew nothing about. We don't have any boots on the ground in order to control the situation. There are these stories about the arsenals being looted. You might have read that in the paper in the Times. Christ, in Iraq, and this, by the way, is an interesting extent to which constructivism is a force in things. How people see things and the frames they use. I remember in 2004, there was an arsenal in Iraq. There were stories that appeared in the New York Times about arsenals in Iraq that were looted just before the election, our election. And people were talking about it because Iraq had been, at that point, been coded a failure. And so the looting of arsenals was a big thing. My God, these weapons are going out there. Who knows which bad guys are getting them? And sure enough, you had an insurgency and it fanned out and so forth. These stories in Libya about, giant government arsenals, people drive up and take missiles and go out where they will. So far, no one cares because we've coded Libya as a success, and I truly hope it turns out to be one. But if it is, we will have dodged a bullet, because they pretty much got lucky, because they did none of the sort of things that I say they should have done, and they still managed, at least so far, to get away with it. So it's I will admit it's sort of humble pie. But last thing I'll close on is the Inchon problem. Was Inchon a good idea? Well, it turned out to be one of the great American military victories in American history. Okay, everyone who studied this knows that MacArthur wanted to do this, and everyone else around him thought it was an incredibly dumb idea. And they sent it up to the chain, and the Joint Chiefs thought it was a dumb idea. And basically, everyone thought this is crazy. If the tides are off, if anybody is guarding the place, my God, this is insane. You're going to be massacred. There's low chance. And he bullied his way into it, and no one could tell MacArthur no at this point. And so they did it, and it worked, and it became this great success. If you take your entire salary and you go to Atlantic City and you put it all on, Snake Eyes, and Snake Eyes comes up, was it a smart thing to do? Well, you won. But to judge the question successfully, you have to look at it sort of ex ante rather than ex post. Because, yes, some schmuck wins the lottery every day. That doesn't mean it's sensible to take a large part of your retirement savings and bet on the lottery. So I would say, and again, we'll see. I hope I will continue to say that every way they approached Libya was wrong. So far, I absolutely will admit it has not gone as badly as I expected it to go based on that kind of stuff. But I am not super optimistic about it, and I still think it was irresponsible, even if they dodge a bullet, to have approached it with the careless lack of planning that they seemingly did.
Thanks. I think we'll have to close on this. Gideon, thanks for a fascinating talk. Let's give a round of applause. Please join us outside for a little reception near the stairways. Thanks.
Absolutely terrific.
Thank you. Exactly. No, and in fact, you could say that. Well, and you could also say that the successive